Hey, what's going on, guys? It's frik back with another video, and today I have my STABBRR build for you guys. So, recently in Wonderlands, these melee builds have become a lot more popular, probably because you can do some crazy damage with them. So, I'm going to be showcasing to you guys 2 or 3 different ways that you can spec this build. So, I'm going to try to keep each part very short and sweet. If you guys just take a quick look now, I'm going to show you how to have it more of a balanced approach between Stabbo and BrrZerker, and then I'm going to show you how you can lean more into Stabbo for a little bit more gun damage, and vice versa into BrrZerker for a little bit more melee damage and a little bit more survivability. Okay, so before we really get into the nitty-gritty of this build, I just want to say to you guys that there's really no perfect way to spec this build or perfect set of gear to go with this build. There's a few things that are going to be our core elements of the build, and I will mention them to you guys, but as for the rest of it, there's skill points left over. They can be spent elsewhere. There's a bunch of alterations you can make to this build to suit your playstyle a little bit better. As for our abilities, we're going to be running Ghostblade, From the Shadows, or Dreadwind all the time. I don't think Feral Surge really fits into the build. If you guys feel that it does, absolutely go for it. But like I said, depending on if we're mobbing or bossing, we're going to switch between Dreadwind, From the Shadows, and Ghostblade. Okay, so for our Stabbo tree, we're going to go 5 out of 5 in Arsenal, and then 3 out of 3 in follow-up. So what's interesting about this perk here is when we are using our live wire as our primary weapon and have it out as we're meleeing enemies, it's going to chain enemies with an electric little bolt that's going to do gun damage. Now what's interesting about that is as we're chaining, it's going to build these stacks up. So we're constantly meleeing, constantly building stacks, and constantly just accumulating more damage. So that's going to work extremely well with a live wire. Now to synergize that, we're going to use Exploit Their Weakness, Contagion, and Alchemical Agent, as well as Blast Chill, which I'm going to talk about when we get to the BrrZerker side of things, but for now I'm going to stick to these 3. So Exploit Their Weakness is going to randomly apply, well actually I lied, Contagion is going to randomly apply a status effect, and then Exploit Their Weakness is going to do increased damage when they have that status effect applied. Now with that, Alchemical Agent, melee critical hits apply a random status effect. So these 3 things are all just synergizing. We have one to apply the status effect, which is also going to spread it. We have one which, when we do melee chances, or melee crit hit chances, we are going to apply a random status effect, and then it's all getting buffed by Exploit Their Weakness. So what's very interesting is when we use a live wire, when we're chaining those enemies after melee hits, they all have a chance to get a status effect on them. And that's why this is such a big part of this build. As for the 6 points in Elusive, Shadow Step, Swift Death, and Nimble Fingers, you guys could really spend them elsewhere. That's just kind of where I went with the build. Same thing with Alchemical Agent. If you guys want to take that out of the build completely and spec into, say, 5 out of 5 in Swift Death and the remainder in Sneak Attack, you could buff your gun damage a little bit, but that's just a different route. Like I said, I'm going to mention to you guys a couple variations to which way you could lean and do a little bit damage elsewhere. So for the BrrZerker side of things, we're going to go 5 out of 5 into Savagery and the Old Ways. So Savagery is going to give us straight up melee damage, and then the Old Ways is going to give us 30% damage while close up. So essentially it's going to give us 30% to our melee damage because all melee kills are going to be close up, but it's also going to increase that little bit of that chain damage that we're doing from the live wire there. So when we're meleeing enemies and chaining them, you can pretty much assume that there's going to be groups of enemies, so they're going to be close to you and you're doing 30% extra to them, but we're also getting a 30% damage reduction, which is going to help with a little bit of survivability. As for the Icebreaker and Cold Snap here, we opted for Cold Snap instead of Haste because it gives us a little bit of frost efficiency, which is then going to, in a way, sort of synergize Icebreaker because it's going to keep those enemies frozen longer, and then we can have up to 30% extra damage from that. As for Unarmored Defense, we're taking this just to drop our shield to 50 and then make it a little bit easier for us to break our shield and then use that buff from the Cursed Wit, but it's also going to increase our maximum health, so we're getting a little bit of survivability from that. Ancient Fury, a little bit more survivability, and then 25% extra area damage, which is then, again, going to buff our melee damage, essentially. And then Relentless Rage here, this is an optional one, but as you guys may know, Save Your Soul is a little bit hard in this game, I guess. Enemies tend to run away and can be hard to get up sometimes, and since we're kind of speccing to go to melee, if enemies aren't close, it might be a little bit hard for us to do a lot of damage with our gun. So this is going to buff our Save Your Soul timer as we do damage. Lastly, we have Blast Chill. So 1 in every 5 melee attempts, we have a chance to, well, it's going to happen 1 in 5 times. So it's not a chance, it's 1 in 5 times we're going to proc a Frost Nova, which is going to deal Frost ability damage, which is essentially 50% of our melee damage. So this is going to do a ton of damage. It's actually insane. You guys may have seen it in the gameplay that I put in the beginning, or you'll see it at the end. When we're just meleeing a boss, at some point, it's just going to wipe the boss, our melee, because of this perk right here. So this, in synergy with Alchemical Agent, Contagion, and our Exploit the Weakness, our status effect damage is incredible with this build. And honestly, with a live wire, this build just becomes a cheat code. So the gear side of things get a little interesting. You guys will see here that I have 3 different live wires. I have 1 for gun damage, 1 for melee damage on skill start, and 1 for melee damage on spellcast. So these 3 things are going to proc at different times. I have this one because I kind of wanted to stick with the live wire thing, keep it going. And then I also have a Sword Explosion here just for boss damage. If I don't feel like meleeing it, this will probably wipe it. If you guys haven't seen my last video, be sure to check that out. As for the melee weapons, you're probably going to want to go with the Wailing Banshee because that's going to have the highest base damage. But I've also noticed that the Spellblade does a ton of damage. So the perks that you're going to want on these kind of depend, I suppose. So if you want more action skill cooldown, you can go for something like Ancient. But if you want to go and try to, dip into your other damage that you have in the build, you could go for something like Echo. So if you have a bunch of, say, spell damage or something like I do on, let's see what spell it is here. I believe it's this one. I have 200% extra spell damage here. So if I were to throw something like a Spellblade on, I'm gaining a ton of damage from that. So like I said, guys, there's a ton of variation. You could literally go with any of these. You can go with the Metal Flute here, which is going to bounce a skull around after melee hits, and that's going to cause status effect damage, which then Exploit the Weakness can buff. We can go here with a Goblin Pickaxe. I have amped on this one. Melee attacks are going to amplify our gun damage. It's also, with the Goblin Pickaxe ability, going to help us, cool down our skills and spells as we pick up gold, which pretty much happens all the time when we're playing the game. So there's many different routes that you can go with this build. There's no specific melee weapon that you have to lock yourself into. You can, mess around, see what you like, see what's fun. So yeah, there's a lot of variation there. As for the rings and like actual gear, it's pretty standard. You're going to want to go with melee damage on your rings, go for, melee crit chance, action skill cooldown, whatever of those you would like. As for the gear mod, we're going to go with something like a Warp Paradigm, or you could probably go with the Plate Mail, but I'm going with the Paradigm that has melee damage and ability damage are increased by 35% of your increased spell damage. So like I said, 35% of 200%, say on the spell here, that's a bunch of extra damage just coming from not melee damage. So there's a ton of ways that you can really work extra damage in. Another one with being the Cursed Wit, getting that extra 100% from the breaking of the shield. We have all damage dealt here with a little bit of frost damage on there, and then we also have cooldown. And then finally, into the spells, I guess things can get a little bit complicated because there's different ways you can go. So if you really want to go for frosting enemies and doing that 30% extra with Icebreaker, you could go for something like a Sigil here. That's going to, cast that bubble around you, and it's going to suck enemies in, and it's going to do that 30% extra damage. Or you could go with something like a Buffmeister and From the Shadows. So yeah, there's a ton of variation that you could really go with this build. There's a ton of directions that you could go with this build. So this is the last thing that I really want to touch on. And this is going to be pretty much for bossing. So Moxsy discovered a crazy interaction with the live wire. Not only did he discover the chain interaction, he discovered another interaction. I'm going to leave both links in the description of this video. Be sure to check those out if you want a better breakdown and a more in-depth breakdown. But yeah, all credits to him. So when we empty the live wire's clip, we're going to do a ton of extra damage. So as you guys can see there's just 300k, 400k, it all pops up, and that's literally just from the chaining of the bolts from the live wire. So you guys can see right there, nothing really happened that time, but you guys can see there we get a bunch of damage from the live wire, and then this should be our 5th hit. You guys can see right there, there's a ton of damage being produced here, and that's simply from our skills, and then once again our live wire chaining enemies. And then that blast chill, as you guys can see right there, there's 3 million damage right there, and that's all blast chill. And you guys can see here, even our status effect damage is hitting for 20k at a time. So it's pretty incredible what this build is capable of. You're pretty much going to one-shot any adds that you encounter. Bosses tend to be a little different sometimes. You know, with that blast chill, it procs like 1 in every 5. And occasionally, you'll see like random ramps in damage, and I think that's just from all the skills proccing at one time. But for most instances when you're bossing, you hit him a few times, and one of those hits is going to wipe him. It just might not be that first one, so you might not get that satisfying one, you know, swipe, one melee hit, and it wipes him. But as for, I guess, the rest of the build, there's not much to it. I could show you my hero points, and that's just pretty much into crit hit damage and crit hit chance. I spec'd into status effect damage a little bit just to bump that, but you guys could definitely go into max ward HP, even skill cooldown or spell cooldown, just really depending on what you want to do. And then the very, very, very last thing I wanted to tell you guys about was you want to pay attention to the power on this armor. And this is where speccing into more gun damage or a balanced build or even more melee is going to come into play. So if you spec like higher power into BrrZerker, you're going to be more effective in your melee, pretty much. I guess there is some melee coming from Stabbo, and that's kind of why I'm 50-50 here. But I could switch right over to a pretty much identical piece with BrrZerker as the primary power there, other than for the frost damage there, which is obviously just synergizing with blast chill. But like I said, guys, there's not much to it. It's pretty much just that blast chill that's going to get you guys that incredible damage, and then the live wire chains. The armor, like I said, very, very, very much up to you guys. A lot of variation with what you can do. This is just the way I'm building it right now and what I would recommend. But thanks for watching, guys. Be sure to check out those videos in the description, because you guys definitely will have a better understanding of how these kind of interactions work, and that way you can kind of optimize your build in your own way. But thank you for watching, guys, and I will see you next time. Peace out.